It's estimated that almost 40% of trial master files are made up of relevant communications. However, the best practices surrounding how to manage email communications and other correspondence are hard to come by. In today's episode of the State of TMF, we'll be covering how to manage email communications properly and how to put in place a process that your team can rely on. The State of TMF is officially in session. Let's get into it. Thank you for joining us on your Wednesday. I hope everybody's getting excited for the weekend or on the downward slope to the weekend. Another great episode of the State of TMF Live, a bi-weekly podcast for all things TMF. We'll give everybody a minute or so to join before we get jumping in. We've got a really awesome session planned today, specifically focusing on email communications. So I'm sure that's why most of you are here, trying to tackle some of the challenges that come from trying to figure out what to do with emails. So we're going to hopefully provide some practical advice and guidance and discussion around how we can best manage the TMF correspondence and communications within your TMF process. All right, so I think we'll get started. First of all, thank you everybody for joining live for the State of TMF this week. We've got an awesome session planned focusing on TMF correspondence and communication. Just as a note for everybody, the State of TMF is a bi-weekly live event and podcast designed specifically to help you level up your TMF process and take your TMF strategy to the next level. Each of the sessions is focusing on a specific and focused subject within the realm of TMF, giving you the opportunity to get insights on how to improve inspection readiness, identify and scale optimization programs, train your team to operate at scale, and of course, understand what it takes to create a world-class TMF team and program. Before we jump in, maybe what I'll do is just a brief introduction. So for those of you that haven't met me before, my name is Oliver. I'm the Director of Growth Marketing here at Montreal, a 10-year TMF veteran. I don't know if I can call myself that. I'm surrounded by much more experienced veterans on the line today. Donatella Ballerini, who you've met before, and then we have a new guest on the podcast today, which is Paul Fenton, President and CEO of Montreal. I don't know if Paul, Donatella, you want to say a quick hi?
Hi guys, nice to see you all.
Hi everyone, thanks for being here today.
All right, perfect. So let's get into it. So episode 2, we're focusing on building an intuitive process for TMF correspondence. The last episode we focused on was note to files. We've got lots of really, really great content and subjects that we're going to be tackling every other week. So please make sure to join. If you are unable to attend the entire session today, no worries. You can actually listen to this on YouTube, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc. A few days after the event goes live. So let's jump into the subject today, building an intuitive process for TMF correspondence. And I think the best place to start is really the regulation. I mean, it's often the best place to start. So Donatella, what do we know about email communication filing requirements from the regulatory authorities, or maybe what don't we know?
Yeah, sure, Oliver. So I think that you have starting with the right approach, because definitely it's very important, in my opinion, to understand what are the requirements from a regulatory perspective. And definitely the first requirement, the first rule that we have to always consider is ICA-GCP when it comes to, TMF management. And if we have to look to ICA-GCP, we see that in relevant communication, there is no the detail of emails. So we've got letters, meeting notes, notes of telephone calls. So let's say emails is not in the list of relevant communication, but it's obvious that email is a relevant communication. In fact, the EMA guidance on TMF management explain that even emails are part of the story, are part of the trial master file, because they tell the story. Sometimes they tell a piece of the story, and so they must be considered a relevant document to reconstruct the story of the trial. So definitely email must be taken into consideration when it comes to trial master file, when it comes to ensure the completeness of our trial master file. So correspondence must be managed somehow. And I think that today we are all here because it's really a challenging aspect of our TMF process, how to manage in a proper way correspondence and especially emails.
Yeah, I think one thing, if I can just add, Donatella, that I find interesting here is when we look at ICH E6R2, which obviously is a few years old now.
Yeah.
But when it came out, there were emails existed, but they don't refer to it here.
Yeah, exactly.
Letters, meeting notes, or notes of telephone calls. I'm not sure how many people make telephone calls today.
I agree.
We used to, but it'll be interesting to see what happens with ICH E6R3, because obviously there's a lot of discussion around this particular section. So section 8, 8.1, 8.2, 8.3, which lists out essential documents, but doesn't go really very far when it comes to essential documents. And so it's definitely a very big discussion point right now. What's going to happen to this section, and are they going to get more specific? And also, are they going to modernize in terms of the things they're listing? Because obviously emails should be here. And letters, who sends letters anymore?
I don't know. I love letters, but I think that in the last year, never written a letter. So.
Yeah.
And why do you think that it wasn't included in sort of the initial rollout of R2?
No.
It's an interesting point.
I think, this is a really personal opinion that maybe, sometimes you don't think that email can be used as an evidence. Right. When we discuss about the importance of TMF, why TMF is important, because if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So the TMF is the evidence for the sponsor to demonstrate compliance, is the evidence of what happened for the inspector. And at the end, even emails are an evidence. I mean, you can use emails even during a court proceeding, so they can be a proof,
yeah.
So they've got a relevance weight in terms of legal aspect.
Yeah, I think that ICH E6R2, if I remember, basically just took what was in the original ICH E6 and copied and pasted basically this particular section. So they didn't sort of review this part, I think, when they brought out R2. And so the original ICH E6 obviously came out in a time when email was really just kind of starting out. So I think that it's just a legacy thing. And there are actually many issues with this particular section of ICH E6, not just about emails, but in general, it's very deficient. And so that's why I think a lot of people are trying to work out, what do we do with this?
Yeah, totally agree. It is one of the the case where you've got the guidance, but it's not very clear, it's ambiguous, it's not so defined, so there can be interpretation and all
this. But I think the good thing is obviously there was the guidance that came out from EMA on trial master files, which is very specific and very email is part of the trial master file. So that's really what we should be referring to.
Totally agree.
All right, perfect. What I wanted to talk about next was, we talked a lot about the guidance documentation, when it comes to what's included and what's not included, but obviously naturally that presents some issues. It makes filing communications and the process problematic. And I think from what we see, and I'd love to hear Paul and Donatella's thoughts here, but often some of the issues that we see are study teams lack a clear understanding of what the best practices are, which hopefully we'll address today. Obviously that there's no defined process for what is relevant or not relevant when it comes to communications. Teams then, as a result, resort to filing everything, which presents an even larger issue. And then, often we might find that communications are filed in different places at different levels from zone to zone. So a lack of consistency. And then sometimes we have issues around, what we should be documenting that surrounds a decision. Are we, filing the communication of a decision and not the actual decision itself? So there's a lot of things that come from communications as a whole, it kind of becomes this sort of orb that most people find difficult to understand. Donatella, from your perspective, what are some of the other things that you've seen as problematic when it comes to filing communications?
Well, definitely the fact that majority of the time, when you write an email, there is a cross-check reference about the topic contained in the email. So sometimes it becomes very challenging to understand what was the initial purpose of the email, why the person wrote the email, what was the communication, the agreement, the decision taken in that email, because there can be more variable and influences from other topics. So even the identification of the right artifact, the right zone, can be challenging sometimes, because there can be a transversional reference on the topic. So definitely that is a very challenging part, because you need to define a process. I think that when you listed all these problem issues that we face very often with emails, basically we can combine this in the biggest problem of having a process in place. Again, if you don't understand that emails are part of the story, if you don't understand that emails are relevant and can make the difference in the completeness of your TMF, you will never, develop a process to manage them properly. And so you will fail, because as you said, there will be no consistency. People will get lost because, I can upload in a way and my colleagues in another way. So there will be no rules. That obviously, the outcome will be no consistency in the TMF, and maybe lack even in the completeness of the story. So the definition of the process is really essential to understand and to manage the emails in the TMF management.
I also agree that a big issue is the fact that an email can pertain to multiple areas. And the way that we organize things today with the reference model is we have this relevant communications section in each of the different process zones, but sometimes it's difficult, because in reality you would need to file that email maybe in several different process zones. So how do you deal with that? And then I think another big issue is emails are obviously generated outside of the system in email programs. And so from a completeness standpoint, it's difficult to know, well, what emails are out there. How do we ensure that those emails actually get from those email programs into the TMF? And so just rethinking maybe the way that we communicate in the future is important, to maybe try and get some of these discussions happening directly within the TMF rather than in other programs like email programs. And we'll talk more about that later, I think, in the discussion.
Absolutely. So now everybody on the line is thinking to themselves, okay, I get it. I understand. I'm feeling the pain as much as everybody else is when it comes to filing communications. Let's see if we can focus on something that I think troubles most, which is defining what's not relevant when it comes to communications and what is ultimately relevant. Now, there's lots of things that probably are not relevant, but we obviously want to summarize a couple of different options. Paul, what are some of the big ticket items for you where you'd say that's a big no-no when it comes to communications? I really wouldn't look at filing this in the TMF.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's obviously the email request for vacation that definitely shouldn't holiday pictures, but more importantly, I think that there can be emails that we generate just to manage our day-to-day work. So sending a meeting invite, or generating an email around well, we need to format this contract, or which are kind of business process emails, but they're not emails that are required to tell the story of the study. And so I think that when you're thinking about an email, if it's not telling the story of the study, or if it's not an evidence, then obviously shouldn't be there. And I think it's really important to try and minimize the amount of emails that go into the TMF, because there can be so many, and that can be a finding in itself, because it's just impossible to find information. So anything that's not supporting a decision-making process, or anything that doesn't really have an impact on study outcomes, really shouldn't be in the TMF. And it's a fine line. And it's something that requires a lot of training with teams to make sure that they understand what is relevant and what isn't.
Absolutely. So if we think, now we have a good understanding of what's not relevant, and of course this list could be very, very long, but ultimately giving you guys some guidelines on what are some of the rules that we should be thinking about when we look at relevant and not relevant communications. Obviously, there's also a defined sort of scope of what is relevant to be filed. Donatella, could you sort of walk us through what you would perceive or you decide as relevant communications for when it comes to filing those in the TMF?
Yes, so when it comes to define what is relevant, not only in terms of communication, but also in terms of documentation that has to be filled in the TMF, I think that we have to always remember the data integrity and the patient safety, because those are the two main principles, that are at the basis of our trial master file management of ICH-GCP. So we do everything just to ensure the patient rights, the patient safety, the well-being, and the reliability of the data at the end of the study. So obviously, if an email is related to these two main parameters, obviously that will become a relevant email. Obviously, if there is an agreement, a final decision, a key decision for the trial management contained in an email, because the meeting was not taken, or because there was no the template as an outcome of an SOP. Okay, in that case, the email become relevant because it's going to fill the gap of a piece of the story, and so in that perspective, it makes a lot of sense. It becomes a relevant document to be filled in. Everything that is, protocol violation, trial conduct, reporting, adverse event, all these aspects have an impact again on patient safety and data integrity. So if it is, captured in an email, what happened, how it was managed, and the closure of maybe an issue, fine, that is relevant. And always remember that we work in a pharmaceutical company, in a life science organization, we have to face with SOP. Basically, everything is managed by a process, and majority of the time, the outcome of this process is a document. So I would say that very often, all these decision processes are contained in a document that is the outcome of an SOP. But sometimes it happens that we don't have the SOP, we don't have the template. So whenever something is not captured in an official document, like a meeting minute, a form or a template linked to, the company SOP, that's right. In that case, the email becomes relevant because it's going to replace an official or another document.
All right, perfect. Thank you for that.
Donatella, can I just add something as well?
Yeah, sure.
The last point. So, absolutely, if an email contains an evidence, it needs to be filed, but it's, sometimes decisions can also be captured elsewhere. And in fact, it's better for decisions to be captured elsewhere, either potentially in another system like a CTMS, or in documents that exist in the trial master file. Having less email is always better. So if we can capture it elsewhere, we should. And I think if it's also a really important decision, maybe we want to write up, a memo or something like that, which clearly documents that decision and clearly documents how we came to that decision, rather than having a big long email chain. And you could keep the email as a backup, but the primary decision is documented in a memo. And I think that's a better practice.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Paula. I think that we can apply the same approach that we discussed previous time for not to file. Yeah. They are tools that, and we are not saying that you can't use them, because they are there, so you can use it, but don't abuse of them. So use them in the right perspective, with the right weight, and whenever it is possible, think always that there are other tools, more official, more formal, as you said, that can be used. Because to be fast, it can be easy to write an email, but if you want to tell a better story and maybe be more detailed and express, all the root cause analysis and the action that were taken and all the steps of the process, write an official memo document, and it will be even easier, in my opinion, to fill it in the right place in the TMF.
Yeah, exactly.
So whenever it's possible, try to avoid it. Then obviously they are there, so we can use them, but if possible, try to avoid them and abuse them.
There's some interesting comments in the chat as well from some of the participants. So Meredith from Sanofi, I believe, said another criteria for inclusion may be when the timing of the communication is important to demonstrate, for example, safety reporting. So the whole 24-hour reporting requirement, exactly, and it's kind of interesting to have the email in that case, because you can use it to demonstrate the timeliness. All
right. I think I'll reference your point earlier, Paul. We want less emails. My 12,000 unopened emails in my inbox. I think I'm down. I'm absolutely supporting less emails. But certainly to Donatella's point, I think, like Note2Files, like these other tools that we have, they are tools that we can use to help us pull together the story. If we've defined the right process and the individuals that are involved in the process are trained adequately, they can be very useful to be able to stitch those different pieces together.
And so, one last point, which I think is also really useful. Dawn Nickham from Inception also said, of course, there are meeting minutes as well that we can also produce. So rather than sending an email, put together meeting minutes that can be very useful.
Absolutely.
Thanks for that, Dawn.
All right. I love the audience participation today. This is great. Perfect. Keep them coming in, guys. If you guys have live questions, please keep them flying in. We'll try and answer them as we can. Paul, you can be the question master today. All right. So let's move on to, now that we've looked at what's relevant and not relevant, we've got to start to stitch together what's our process for email communication. So, when we think about what we're doing for our customers, when we help organizations put in place processes for TMF management, we think about communications in these 4 pillars: when, who, where, and what. So Donatella, I'd love to throw this to you to kind of walk through our approach for defining the kind of pillars of your communication filing process.
So I think that, to answer to this question, W question, will really help us to better understand the process that we have to put in place. And what is the fact that there is no, let's say, an official requirement from, regulatory authority. The requirement is that the trimester file must be inspection ready. But let's think about when. So when I have to file the email into the eTMF. So you've got 3 options, basically: file as you go, periodically on a regular basis, or a study closure. All of these 3, let's say, options have a risk and benefits by my experience. My personal perspective and suggestion is file as you go. Just because, in my opinion, this is the principle, of timeliness of TMF. So if the email is a piece of the story and is a relevant document for the story, as all the other documents, I have to fill the email whenever, it's available, whenever it is finalized, let's say. So file as you go, because otherwise it can be really challenging to understand what happened, to retrieve maybe a loop of emails or a final decision. So file as you go. This is, in my opinion, the best approach with the best outcome. Periodically, when I was working at sponsor side, this was an approach that I had experience. This risk and benefit, again, I don't want to critique it at all, but as you said, Oliver, when you turn on the laptop and you see something like 300 emails, try to understand what is relevant, try to fill them in the right artifact section of the TMF. Takes a lot of time. So it can be done, but obviously there are some risks and some potential issue that can come. So my suggestion, again, as preference remain file as you go. As study closure, we did even this kind of approach. And honestly, you know, it was a mess, an issue. I mean, it was, okay, thousand email, and now how can you identify the topic, if it is relevant, if it is not, because basically we just pull everything in Outlook and just create a study specific email boxes. So everything was there. We can say that we didn't delete anything, but you know, to have an organized and structure of the emails, impossible. So again, you can do that, but there are lots of risks and lots of issues that I see in this approach. So you can even test this, let's say, free option and find what is more feasible for you and for your team, because remember also who is responsible, and this is the second step for you know, filling and choosing what is relevant in terms of email. I give you this example that we had with a customer of e-TMF services. The responsible person for email was the CTA. Perfect. Let's say we can say that a responsible person was identified. This person was in charge of filling the email, the relevant email in the TMF. Two issues. First of all, this person had other staff and responsibility to manage, not only emails, so it can be really challenging to be always in time and not in delay with filling the email. Secondly, she was not always in the loop of the email. So let's say it was upon the responsibility and sensitivity of you know, the other stakeholders to forward her the email to be filled in the TMF. So it's not sufficient, you know, to identify someone responsible. I think it's better to identify in the stakeholder game of TMF management who is doing what, because there will be the sponsor, but then there will be the CRO who will issue emails maybe without, you know, forwarding them to the sponsor. So there are lots of stakeholders, and it will be very, very important to define who is doing what to ensure the consistency and to ensure that all the pieces in case of relevant communication are there and are filled and available in TMF. Where, as Paul said before, this is another very, let's say, tricky point where there is no regulatory requirement. It's up to us and up to our process. Because you know that in the TMF reference model, there is the specific section in each zone for relevant communication. So you can decide to, you know, put them in the relevant communication section, for example, of trial oversight, or you can decide to put the relevant communication in the artifact it is referred to. For example, as the person said before, if you are submitting a document to a competent authority and you want to file that email because it contains a relevant information about the timing of submission, maybe you can, you know, fill the email in the submission to regulatory competent authority and not in the relevant correspondence. So you can have these two approaches, up to you decide what is more feasible for you with less risk. The hybrid one, yes, you can have also an hybrid, but in my opinion, it will, let's say, not ensure consistency, because it's something that, you know, inspectors want to see, is something that they look for, you know, understand the standard rule, the standard process that you put in place. So if you put one email in relevant communication and the other in the relevance artifact, can create confusion, unless obviously there is a relevant rationale. In terms of what, this is, I think, the most challenging aspect when we try to file the emails, and I really like to hear Paul's opinion, because this is really a very technical issue to be considered with lots of implication and impact. So, Paul, what do you think about that?
Oh, you're on mute, Paul.
Yeah, this is live, so these things happen. I forgot to unmute myself. Sorry about that.
Because you didn't want to answer, because it's too difficult and you didn't want to answer.
No, I have a very, I think it's a really interesting area and an interesting question, because I'm kind of a tech guy, right? So Yeah, I was reading the guidance from the reference model. So the reference model actually put out a guidance in 2020 on email correspondence, which is great. You know, it's actually quite big. It's quite a few pages, and there's a lot of really good information in there. So if you haven't read it, go and read it. It's on the website. But they talk about the format, and the discussion is around, well, original format. So there are various different formats. There's .msg, there's .eml, which are basically the native formats from the email programs that we're using. So things like Gmail or Outlook, or, you know, all of those different email programs typically have their own standard. Now, the advantage of having these native formats is they actually contain quite a lot of information around who sent the email, when it was sent, what was the time zone, what was the IP address they used. So there's a lot of traceability information, which potentially could be useful for demonstrating, you know, the custody of that email, and, you know, being able to demonstrate exactly when it was sent and having some proof. But for me, there are definitely some challenges with having native format. And the first challenge is the fact that we have to retain it for 25 years. And are we going to still be able to read that format? Because the way to read that format is using one of these programs like Outlook. Are we still going to be able to read it in 25 years? And that's kind of a bit of an overhead, because you're going to have to continuously make sure that you can read it, because it's a record and it has to be readily retrievable. The other format that a lot of people use is PDF or PDFA, which is kind of the ISO format for PDF. And that's kind of a format that we typically use for long-term retention because it's an ISO standard. The argument for not using PDF or PDFA is that we lose that kind of traceability information that's in the header of the email message. But I was sort of thinking about this, and I was thinking, well, surely we could extract that information and just include it maybe as part of the PDFA that we generate. And you know, it sort of brings us to how we generate these PDFs, because I think there are two ways of doing it. You can either go into your email and print an email, and I say print a PDF. And when you do that, you are going to get some information like the subject, and you'll probably get who sent it and who received it and when it was sent. But you're not going to get all of that other detailed information. That's going to be lost when you generate that PDF. Or, and this is for any vendors on the line, and obviously it's something that we're also considering, maybe there's a way of actually extracting that information using a program that generates the PDF and actually sort of appending it, maybe as an appendix to the email that's been PDF'd, so that we actually retain all of that information. The other thing that's important to note is that obviously these records that are going to be stored in a 21 CFR Part 11 compliance system, that's going to have an audit trail. So if we're worried about traceability, well, if it's in your system and there's an audit trail turned on, if anybody goes and tries to modify that email, because it's a text file ultimately, the MSG format, the audit trail is going to detect that, and it's the same for a PDF as well. So I'm not too worried about that. I'm more worried about the long-term retention and the long-term retrievability of these formats.
So there's an interesting point here in the chat, and there's a couple comments around, and I'll read it directly. So because email systems, Outlook, Gmail, etc., are not Part 11 compliant, I'm assuming that they haven't been validated, let's say, to store records. Should emails be printed out and signed prior to filing in the TMF? Now, I know that Paul's shaking his head because we don't want to be printing things out anymore. But what is the recommendation here for those that are probably thinking, okay, well, should we just do it like we've always done it, where we print stuff out and sign it? And do we even need to sign it?
Well, so
that's
I've
another question.
I've got an opinion. I'm sure that Donatella does too. But number one, don't use any more paper. We need to save the trees. Sure. Number two, if you can print an email electronically, as I just described, so you could print it into a PDF format, but it could be construed as a copy, right? And therefore, we need to have a certified copy process. And so I think that if and Donatella's going to speak a little bit more about process and making sure that we have a clearly defined process for managing communications. Part of that would be producing PDFs from your email program and making sure that the output to PDF is an exact copy of what you had in the original email. And so it goes back to your certified copy process that you have to have in place, by the way, both based on EU regulations as well as FDA regulations. So both say you have to have a certified copy process. There is a difference, though, between the two. The EU does not say that you need to sign something to say that it's a certified copy. The FDA alludes to the fact that you should sign it. I don't necessarily agree with that. It's kind of a gray area. But definitely, you should be referring back to your certified copy process and making sure that someone's actually looking at the PDF output to make sure it truly is an accurate copy of what you originally had in that email.
It's so funny. I feel like emails has become, it's one of those subjects. It's almost like an oracle where you figure out a solution, then you go, oh, well, now we've got to figure out certified copies. And they go, okay, well, what about if we did this? Oh, well, what about validated systems? Oh, okay, well, what about if we did? And it just goes on. It's such a challenging subject to
and I don't think we're going to start validating Outlook.
I mean, yeah.
Let's not do it.
No, and you, Paul, have opened another, in my opinion, very big topic and big door of challenging TMF management, which is certified copy, because I faced that issue, that topic several times with several of our customers, also in TMF services, because they were asking for this certified copy, try to destroy the paper, to avoid paper, because obviously we would like to have no paper, just electronic eTMF, but for different reasons, it's still not possible. So we are almost everyone living in a hybrid situation. And certified copy, believe me, I tried to implement this approach when I was working at a sponsor, and after 1 year of a project, we give up. We said, no, it's too difficult. And at the end, we're going to produce more paper than we wanted to delete. For the issue of sign and confirm that the document is original and equal to the source document. So it's not really easy. You open another door. So definitely, in my opinion, what we suggest during the training that we do and the process development with our customer is we can give you the best practice, but then try to develop a risk-based approach for defining what is the best choice for you. So what are the risks if you follow this option? What are the benefits? But if I follow, the other option, what are the risks and the benefit? Because there will be, worst aspect and the bad aspect in every situation. So you have to balance at the end of the day what is best with less risk, let's say, and less impact on the story of the trial.
Yeah. And let's remember that certified copies apply paper to electronic, but also electronic to electronic.
Yeah, that is the other point.
It's definitely, so maybe don't delete the emails yet, maybe, work it out.
I said this on the last session, but I'll say it again. This TMF stuff's not easy, eh? It's not easy. There's a question here from Annette, and it goes back to the sort of inbox and the sort of strategies. And, we haven't talked too much about that here, but maybe I'll throw this as a question to you, Donatella. The question from Annette is, would you recommend setting up a specific inbox to CC when an email is identified as relevant communication by the sender? That way, all relevant communications go to a central location, which can be uploaded by a designated person.
So in theory, this can be a very helpful approach. It makes a lot of sense, but I have to admit that in my experience, because we used that approach, it didn't work, because at the end, it was a really multiplication of emails, and people, prefer not to think, okay, I have to consider this email as relevant, so to include the study-specific email box or not. Because it was easier and faster, they just put the email box everywhere for every email. So at the end, it didn't. The theoretical logic behind this process makes sense, but in reality, it doesn't work with people.
Yeah, no, I know that in our system, for example, obviously we have an eTMF system and we do have a study inbox, but we use it mainly for site documents. So sites that need to send documents into a central location to be filed. And for that, I think it works well. But for using it for correspondence and having the whole study team send their correspondence there, you're right, Donatella. Just people just automatically include it, and then it becomes a complete mess. And then the other big problem is that obviously a communication is between one and multiple people. And so if each sends their own copy of that email correspondence, all of a sudden you have 15 duplicates.
Yeah.
It's become a real problem. I think email actually is a really good candidate for AI, email correspondence. I think that AI could be used to actually manage it a lot better, because with AI, we can do things like detecting duplicates very easily, because it's pattern based, right? So and even sort of analyzing the language, so natural language processing within the email, and then deciding, okay, well, what does this relate to, and then proposing that so that we can better relate email correspondence to study processes or other artifacts within the TMF could be super useful. So I think anybody who's in the AI business, very good candidate here. There's a lot of problems to be solved.
All right. Paul's already typing an email to our engineering team, I can tell.
I already told them that. I told them that months ago already. Yeah.
All right, perfect. So I think, just in summary, I think to Donatello and Paul's point, I think when it comes to creating a central inbox for that communication, in theory, it can make sense. You can use a forwarding or maybe even a flagging or some sort of rule-based system where you forward certain information that you think is relevant to a folder. But all of this can come crashing down like a house of cards if you don't have the right process and you haven't trained people on the right process. Naturally, as human beings, we are full of faults, and we will always, or most of the time, take the easy route. And sometimes it's easier just to tag everything or forward everything, and then you're still left with the same mess to clean up at the end of it, which is only then amplified by the volume and the amount of communication that you might have. So let's move on. Keep throwing the questions in. We do have quite a few questions around other communication, so things that aren't email, but we're going to talk a little bit about that in a few slides. Let's talk about some of the key ingredients, because I think it's very easy to talk about, okay, well, what's relevant and what's not relevant, but there's some things that we should be thinking about, because not all emails are created equal, right? So from your perspective, Donatella, when we think about sort of understanding and structuring the process for filing, it's not just about what's relevant and what's not relevant, right? There's also other things that we should consider.
Absolutely, Oliver. It's as we said, it's a very complex process, and you need to consider lots of aspects, lots of steps, lots of details, and you have to identify and establish a rule. Feeling responsibility. As we already discussed, there are a lot of stakeholders in TMF management, so lots of stakeholders are going to issue emails. So who is going to do what? The originator, the primary recipient, both, the sponsor, the CRO. So who is responsible for managing and coordinate this process? The email subject line. I mean, even in that case, people need to be educated on how to write an email subject line. Must be concise and focused. So don't repeat information, don't make unuseful information, just put what is relevant to make it clear, the content of the email. Document date. We have a requirement that, emails have to be in a chronological order. So it must be very important to define as a rule the document date. The attachment. The attachment. How can you, upload the attachment? How do you manage the attachment? It's obvious that if the attachment is important, is relevant, you should, PDF, for example, the attachment as well with the email. But if the attachment, is, for example, a meeting minute or a template, a form already filled in another section of the TMF, maybe you just fill the email without the attachment. to avoid duplication. So there are a lot of consideration to be done on attachment because sometimes it makes sense to combine the email with its attachment, sometimes no. So definitely you need to identify the different, let's say, scenarios that you can face in order to define standard rules, because in that way you can ensure the consistency in the process. Otherwise, as already given an example, the CTA will upload all the attachment, and another CTA will just upload filling the emails and not the attachment. And the same for embedded links. Whenever it's possible, please avoid embedded links, because we faced the issue with one of our customers last week, and it's really a mess. Try to, permit the content of the embedded links to be traceable and legible at any time. As Paul said, it's very important, when you're dealing with emails to keep the data integrity. And obviously, if I include a link into an email, from an inspector point of view, I have to have the access to that link. But how can I ensure the access in 25 years? How can I ensure the access even 1 week after? Because, web change, page of change. So it's really challenging when you put a link into an email. So what you can do, you can, just try to do a PDF of the web page that you want to link, of the link, try to, reconstruct the story of the email into the PDF. So always remember that everything that is in the email must be readable, accessible, and legible, especially to an inspector. So attachment and links are always very tricky. And again, we go back to the suggestion: try to avoid email as much as possible, unless obviously it is necessary. Change to the subject matter of an email. This will open really a big discussion, because this is again a sort of a lack of education in people using the email as a tool for working, because you start maybe with a protocol deviation, and then you attach another, let's say, communication from another topic, or maybe from another site. So the loop, the chain of the email will become with no end, and it will be very challenging and difficult to understand, where to fill, what was the purpose, what was the final decision that have an impact on the trial. So if you have to start a new conversation, a new topic, just write a new email. Don't, try to start this very infinitive chain of email that at the end will be very challenging to treat from TMF perspective. Don't forget the periodic review. I mean, if we said that emails are equal to essential document in TMF, essential document must be reviewed on a regular basis. Email, same approach. It's not just a matter of filling them, it's just a matter of doing periodic review. So treat them as an official document of your TMF. Unblinding information, obviously, this is very critical as aspect in TMF for documentation, and especially for emails. So always think about having a process in place on how to manage unblinding documentation and unblinding information, especially in emails. And last but not least, translation. This is a very not funny, because it's not funny, it is tricky to manage, but just to give you my experience. When we used to work with Italian CRO, when I was working at the sponsor side, we used to write emails in Italian, and I think it's obvious. I mean, finally you speak with someone that speaks your language, you don't have to translate everything. So basically you write everything in Italian. Then the study was moved to another study team, and the study team was based in France. And obviously nobody was speaking Italian. So they were not able to understand all the relevant communication field in the TMF. They were not able to perform QC. They were not able to understand the story. So we had to pay for official translation for all the Italian document, because there was a change in the study team. As Paul said, even for inspection, if they come and they need to check a document that is not in their native language, can be, tricky, but also for an internal study team, I think it's important to have the vision that everyone should be able to understand the content of the email. And this is why, for example, we put this requirement in an SOP that emails, when relevant, had to be written in English, because in that way it was possible, to be read by everyone involving in the study. Even there was a change in the study team members. So let's say it was a lesson learned from an issue that we face, and it was helpful also to understand what is relevant, because whenever it comes, to write an email, it was like, okay, I write this email in Italian, or I have to write this email in English because it's relevant. So it was an effort, let's say, from the single study team member, but it helped to reduce the feeling of email in the TMF. I don't know, Paul, if you agree on translation, but it's something that, sometimes people don't think about that, but managing global trial, I think.
No, I think definitely, being very clear about use of language is important. There's another point raised in the chat, which I think is also an important consideration, and that's when you have emails that discuss details of different studies, because it could open a door to audit or inspection questions. So something to think about as well. Be careful not to mix in multiple studies with your emails, because obviously the inspector's going to see it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. All right, so let's move on, because we're just looking at the time here. So now what we want to talk about is, okay, we've gone through what's relevant and what's not relevant. We've talked a little bit about how to define the process. Now we need to think, okay, well, where do we put that process down in writing? And the short answer is there's a couple different options, right? So when it comes to documenting the communication filing process, that could be done perhaps in an SOP, could be perhaps done in your TMF plan, or even a business rules document. Donatella, when you think about, where to document the communication filing process, what's your sort of first thought when you think, okay, this is probably the best place for me to communicate this? Or is a bit of it in everything kind of the approach that you take?
So my experience tell me that, to write this kind of details in an SOP means that you will write or a dedicated SOP or working instruction on emails management, or if you want to avoid the proliferation, of SOP for TMF management, because if you think about all the steps, all the aspects, it becomes or 100 pages SOP, about all the things that you have to consider, or one master SOP plus multiple and different working instruction. But my experience then is challenging to manage the exception. It's challenging for people to not to be trained, but to remember what is the content of all the working instruction SOP. So the best play, by my suggestion, would be the TMF plan, even because in that way you can agree each time, based on the study design. So based also on the other vendors and on the other stakeholders, how to manage the process in the proper way. So definitely that is, in my opinion and my experience, the best place to put the details and the references to ensure the consistency of the process. And for example, we did last month a TMF plan training with a customer, and we developed the TMF plan template with them, our template. And we point attention that, email management is a paragraph of our template, because it's really something critical that the majority of the time is not covered in any other procedural document. So we suggested to define the rule in that document to agree with all the other CRO, because it was a study with multiple CROs. So with other CRO, how to manage the emails. Paul, do you agree with this approach?
No, I totally agree. I think also you may end up referencing other SOPs as well. So we were talking earlier about certified copies. Well, you may have an SOP on that, and so you're going to probably reference that from your TMF plan. So there's definitely a connection between the three.
I think obviously training becomes Yeah, exactly. I think training obviously becomes an important part of this process, right? And so, you know, if you've got your sort of general good documentation practices defined and your process defined around documentation and TMF, when you're looking at your TMF plan, you're really calling out those different areas, referencing those different SOPs to pull together the story, so that you're able to adequately train folks. But ultimately, what we're saying here is that this is really up to you guys. You can decide whether it's an SOP or within your TMF plan. The folks that I'm sure many of on the line today were at the conference last week, the TMF summit. I think most of the people that I heard were talking about finding communication in their process in the TMF plan, but it is really totally up to you guys. All right, so last few things here. We've talked about what we should be doing. We started with the regulators and what they are asking us to do, but when they come knocking on the door, what do they want to see? So Paul, from your perspective, I want you to put on your auditor and inspector hat, which I know you love to do. What are you looking to see, or what are you expecting to see when you're looking at a TMF when it comes to communications?
Well, first of all, I want to be able to find information easily. Like that for me is like number one, because if I'm an inspector, I probably spend quite a lot of time trying to reconstruct, you know, what's happened in this study. That's part of my job, right? Is to understand the story. And if it's really difficult to find information, and if there's a lot of email correspondence that is just dumped into this relevant correspondence bucket without much descriptive titles or anything like that, it becomes very difficult to find that information. So making sure that it's easy for the inspector to find information, super important, because otherwise you're just going to frustrate them. And then afterwards, I think, having clear communication within that email. So not having a big, long discussion that's gone over, multiple weeks, and I'm having to kind of sift through to try and understand, well, how did they get to that decision? If you're in that situation where there's a very long dialogue, maybe it needs to be summarized in a different document. And that's where we have other tools like memos, like minutes, like notes or files. Other tools which will allow us to give a summary rather than having this very long-winded email. And then also, it shouldn't be confusing. And Donatella brought up a really good point earlier. We're so used to just do reply to all. We end up with these big long chains, and quite often there could be multiple different discussions about multiple different subjects in this one email. As an inspector, I don't really want to see that, because it's going to waste my time trying to figure it all out. It needs to be to the point. So that's, I think, the key things for me. And then also just making sure that, as we said earlier, that there's data integrity, that I can trust what I'm reading, that I have the full picture. And so that's where, I think one of the biggest challenges we have with email is working out, well, when do we file it? When is that email finished? When is it complete? Because it can just go backwards and forwards the whole time, right? So if I'm an inspector, one question I might be asking myself is this the full version? Or is there another version that has other things there? So really not an ideal format to communicate with an inspector.
So let's talk about other formats as we finish off today's session. We haven't got too long left, but we've had lots of comments in the chat today, and obviously, let's address the elephant in the room, that emails is not today the only way that we communicate, either personally or professionally. And obviously, a lot of these tools that we've used in our personal lives have creeped into our professional lives. I think everybody at this point is either using Teams or Slack or Skype in the past, and even things maybe like other social media type messaging apps like WhatsApp and things like that. When we think about these other types of communications, this poses a different problem, right, Paul? Like this can potentially be even more problematic than emails.
Yeah, because I mean, how do we extract this information? If there's relevant decisions being made over Teams, for example, how do we extract that information and bring it into the trial master file? And if you think about the way Teams is, quite often you have to scroll up and down, right, to be able to see the chat. It's a very sort of interactive, dynamic thing. And how do we capture that? Do we have to take screenshots? Not ideal. We're probably missing half of the conversation with a screenshot. Can we get a transcript? Maybe. Does that transcript contain all the information that we require? How do we sort of manage the whole certified copy thing again? How do we retain this information? If we need to retain it in Teams, how long is it in there for? I don't know how long Teams retain. Is it forever? So there's just so many questions around this, and I think it's kind of Pandora's box.
Oh yeah.
And it's something that we as an industry maybe need to start thinking carefully about. What do we do with these things? I think they're super useful. It's great to have this because it's so much easier to make decisions, right? And to collaborate together, especially in the virtual world that we live in. But we do need to be mindful that if we're making decisions that have an impact on the study or the study outcome that we need to include in TMF, we need to have a plan for getting that information out. And maybe it's, again, through the use of other tools like memos for important decisions. But also maybe as a software vendor, I've also been thinking about this. Maybe we can have these kinds of tools directly integrated within our TMF platforms or within our clinical platforms, so that we're actually collaborating in the same way as we do with Teams and Slack, but they're integrated directly, either through some kind of API, or even the TMF platforms themselves can have chat capability, because it's kind of useful. And there you can chat around a query, or you can chat around an artifact or a site and retain this information, and you've got full traceability. So I think there's a ton of things that we need to think about here to make sure that we're not losing information and therefore losing traceability and losing records that need to be part of the TMF.
Right. And I think the easy option is just don't use them and let's stick with email.
Yeah, but that would be a shame, right?
It would be.
They're useful. Jamie
Exactly.
Marie and Johnson mentioned that they do minutes, meeting minutes after every team meeting that has relevant information. So that's the way they go.
I think that
love them.
work.
If they do that, I love them. Definitely.
Don't know if everybody does that. It's difficult to impose. But,
I think it's challenging because then you get into the issue of, okay, well, now we're exporting transcripts and screenshots. Are we then going to have people say, well, do we print these and sign these? And then we're in the same same
kind of boat. But I think that we have the State of TMF podcast series, which is going to go on forever, right? So this, I think, is actually a whole podcast episode in its own right, where we could have some really interesting discussions on the use of social media and collaborative tools like this within clinical trials.
Exactly. All right. Well, look, we'll close it for today because I think we're a little bit over time, but there's obviously a lot more to discuss here, which means you're in the right place. As Paul mentioned, this is certainly a subject we can consider for the future. As a reminder to everybody, go hang out in the community after this. There's over, well, I think at this point, it's over 1,200 members. We share the slide decks from these episodes. So if you want to get access to the content, you can do so. There's obviously exclusive content from Montreal that you can only get access to within the LinkedIn group. Knowledge and networking, of course, and then any Q&A that you might want to do as well. There's lots of super experienced people, especially those that are on the Montreal team. So if you ever want to ask questions, you can go through and do that. I want to thank everybody, of course, for joining, but of course my fellow hosts, Paul and Donatella, it's been a blast as usual. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Oliver. Thanks, Donatella.
Thanks to you.
Thanks everybody for the great questions.
Thanks everyone.
See you next time.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the State of TMF, a live event and podcast brought to you by Montreal, the leaders in clinical, regulatory, and quality systems for scaling life science organizations. If you like today's episode, please follow, subscribe on all of the platforms you may be listening. And if you want to view the full episode with video, head over to YouTube. Thank you for listening to another episode, and we'll see you soon.